He was trained to endure the enemy's worst. The one thing they never prepared him for was the betrayal from his own side. The document before me is the transcript of a secret military tribunal. The date is April 20th, 1946. The room is sterile, silent, stripped of all ceremony. There are two men at its center. One is Lieutenant David Keane. His face is a roadmap of scars, his eyes, hollowed out by 9 months in a Gestapo prison, are fixed on the man opposite him. The other is Captain Frank Miller. He sits upright, his uniform immaculate. His expression is a mask of cold indignation. These two men were once comrades, a spy and his handler. One voice in the darkness, the other a lifeline across the channel. Now, they are the accuser and the accused. One man's testimony is all that stands between a decorated officer and a firing squad. The charge is high treason. How in God's name did it come to this? How does an American captain, a man entrusted with the lives of his agents, sell one of his own to the Gestapo for a bag of cash? To understand this, we need to go back 2 years, to a moonless night over occupied France. On May 12, 1944, Lieutenant David Keane fell through the black sky. His parachute opened with a violent crack, a sudden bloom of silk in the hostile dark. Below him was the cruise region of France, enemy territory. His mission, assigned by the Office of Strategic Services, was simple and impossible. He was to link up with a local resistance network, codenamed Circuit Voltaire. He was to arm them, train them, and turn them into a razor-sharp instrument of sabotage, to slash the arteries of the German war machine before the coming invasion. His codename was Vagabond. Before the war, he was a detective, a man who understood puzzles and people. He was quiet, methodical, and observant, the perfect ghost to haunt the back roads of France. His only link to the outside world, his only connection to home, was a crackling radio signal. And on the other end of that signal, in a secure bunker in London, sat Captain Frank Miller. Miller was his handler, his commander, his lifeline. He was the man who coordinated the supply drops. He was the voice that whispered intelligence updates from the ether. In the lethal loneliness of espionage, trust is not a virtue. It is the only currency you have. And David Keane trusted Captain Miller with his life. The file details Keane's first weeks on the ground. They were a masterclass in clandestine work. He made contact with the leader of Circuit Voltaire, a hardened French carpenter known only as Caron. Keane did not arrive with arrogance. He arrived with respect and with Sten guns. He listened, he learned, and he earned their trust, not as an American commander, but as a fellow soldier in the same shadow war. The connection between Keane and Miller was flawless. In late May, Miller coordinated the first supply drop. Keane and his men watched as the British Halifax bomber flew low over the designated field, dropping canisters filled with explosives, rifles, and ammunition. It was a success. Their teeth were now sharp. As the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6th, Circuit Voltaire, under Keane's guidance, went to work. Declassified reports detail their operations. A railway line severed, delaying a panzer division's move to the coast. A communications cable cut, blinding the local German command. Each act was a small victory, a pinprick in the side of the beast. But the pinpricks were adding up. The network was effective. It was valuable. And Lieutenant Keane, deep in occupied territory, believed his commander in London was watching his back. He had no way of knowing that Captain Miller was looking at the reports from Circuit Voltaire not with pride but with cold financial calculation. He was not assessing their strategic value. He was assessing their market price. While David Keane was sleeping in barns and sharing stale bread with farmers, Captain Frank Miller was living a different war. His battlefield was the gentlemen's clubs and backroom card games of London. His enemy was a string of bad luck and worse judgment. The official personnel file on Captain Miller is unremarkable: a competent administrator, an efficient logistics officer. But there is another file, a shadow ledger, pieced together after the fact by military investigators. It tells a story of mounting gambling debts, of quiet desperation, of a man who saw the assets he managed not in terms of lives but in terms of their liquidation value. By late June of 1944, Miller was cornered. His creditors were no longer polite. He needed a significant amount of money, and he needed it fast. The war had presented him with a unique and monstrous business opportunity. He was the sole gatekeeper for all information flowing to and from one of the most effective OSS networks in France. He held the keys to the kingdom, and he decided to sell them. The contact was made through a discreet channel, a neutral diplomat in Lisbon, a city crawling with spies from all sides. The declassified financial records from a captured German intelligence account show the transaction with chilling clarity. In the first week of July, a proposal was made. An American officer was offering the complete operational details of an active resistance circuit. The price was 50,000 Reichsmarks. To the Gestapo, struggling to contain the bleeding ulcer of the French resistance after D-Day, it was a bargain. The deal was finalized on July 5th. Miller transmitted the information in a series of encrypted bursts. It was a complete vivisection of Circuit Voltaire. He sent a list of 24 code names starting with Vagabond. He provided the coordinates for their primary and secondary safe houses. He included the locations of their weapons caches and their emergency radio protocols. He laid the entire network bare, every secret nerve exposed. He handed his own soldiers to the executioner, and he did it from the comfort of a padded chair. 300 miles away, the money was deposited. Miller was saved from his immediate financial ruin. But the Germans required one final thing: a guarantee. They didn't just want the network's location, they wanted the network itself, gathered, concentrated, and ready for harvest. They wanted the prize delivered. So Captain Miller composed one last message to his agent in the field. It was a message of triumph, of victory. He told Keane that headquarters was immensely pleased with the work of Circuit Voltaire, that their success had earned them a special massive supply drop, new weapons, more explosives, medical supplies, even whiskey and American cigarettes. It was a celebration, a reward for their courage. He gave Keane a new set of coordinates, an isolated farmhouse, miles from their usual area of operations. He stressed the need for absolute secrecy. Only Keane's best men were to be present. The date was set for the night of July 10th. In a damp cellar in the French countryside, David Keane decoded the message. The file contains a copy of his final transmission back to London. It is filled with gratitude. He thanked Miller for his unwavering support. He reported that the morale of his men was sky high. He confirmed that he and 23 of his best fighters would be at the coordinates ready to receive the supplies. It was the culmination of everything they had fought for. It was the validation of their sacrifice. As Keane prepared his men for the rendezvous, a different kind of preparation was underway. An SS mobile unit, acting on the precise intelligence from London, was moving into position. They surrounded the isolated farmhouse, setting up machine gun posts in the tree line. They were not preparing for a fight. They were preparing for an extermination. For David Keane and the men of Circuit Voltaire, their greatest victory was a lie, and the lifeline they had trusted was now a noose tightening around their necks. The night of July 10th was clear. A sliver of moon hung in the sky, offering little light. For the 24 men of Circuit Voltaire, it was a night of profound hope. They moved through the forests of the Creuse region with the quiet confidence of seasoned guerrillas. They were the tip of the OSS spear in central France, a collection of farmers, mechanics, and students all forged into an effective fighting force. And tonight, they were going to be rewarded for their courage. Their commander in London was sending them the motherlode. Lieutenant David Keane led the column. The after-action reports, pieced together from later testimony, paint a picture of a man who was meticulous in his planning. He had followed Captain Miller's instructions to the letter. The rendezvous point was new, an isolated farmhouse 5 kilometers beyond their normal operational zone. The directive for absolute secrecy meant he brought only his most trusted, battle-hardened fighters. He had no reason to doubt the intelligence. Miller had been his lifeline for 2 months. His support had been flawless. Tonight was to be their graduation. They reached the edge of the woods overlooking the target just before midnight. The farmhouse stood dark against the horizon. A single dirt track led up to it, and there was a profound, unnatural silence. Keane, the former detective, felt the first cold prickle of unease. A place like this, even in wartime, should have a sound. A barking dog, the rustle of livestock, the distant rumble of a truck. But there was nothing. Only the whisper of the wind through the tall grass. Why this location? Why the absolute silence? The questions flickered in his mind, but were pushed aside by the logic of his orders. Perhaps the family had been moved out for security. Perhaps this was the price of a truly secret operation. He trusted his handler. He trusted the plan. He gave the signal to advance. They moved across the open field in staggered formation, weapons at the ready. 10 meters from the farmhouse, the world erupted. It was not the friendly flicker of landing lights they had expected. It was the blinding, brutal glare of a dozen high-powered floodlights snapping on simultaneously from the tree line and the windows of the house itself. They were caught in the open, exposed, painted in stark white light like insects pinned to a board. For a frozen half-second, there was only the light and a collective gasp of disbelief. Then the air tore apart. The sound of an MG-42 is unmistakable. It is not a series of shots. It is a single, continuous, violent, ripping sound. The sound of death at 900 rounds per minute. A second gun opened up from the flank, then a third. The men of Circuit Voltaire never stood a chance. It was not a firefight, it was a slaughter. Men were cut down where they stood, their bodies thrown backwards by the sheer kinetic force of the bullets. Shouts of surprise turned instantly into screams of agony. The air was filled with the metallic scent of cordite and the hot, coppery smell of blood. Keane reacted on instinct. He fired his Sten gun towards the nearest muzzle flash, emptying the magazine in a single desperate burst. He was screaming orders. "Cover! Get to cover!" But there was no cover. They were in a kill box. A searing pain exploded in his left shoulder as a bullet slammed into him, spinning him around and throwing him to the ground. He landed hard, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. Through a haze of pain and shock, he saw the last moments of his network. He saw Caron, the brave carpenter, fall with a line of holes stitched across his chest. He saw the 2 young brothers he had trained himself, cut down as they tried to drag a wounded comrade to safety. In less than 60 seconds, it was over. The machine guns fell silent. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was filled with the soft moans of the dying. Heavy, hobnailed boots crunched on the gravel. Dark figures in the field gray uniforms of the SS moved among the bodies, dispatching the wounded with single pistol shots. Keane lay still, trying to control his breathing, a useless prayer on his lips. Then a pair of polished black boots stopped directly in front of his face. He looked up, past the tailored uniform, into the cold, disinterested eyes of an SS Hauptsturmführer. The German officer looked down at the bleeding American, a faint, clinical curiosity in his expression. He did not ask a question. He simply stated a fact. Der Vagabund, he said, the codename a death sentence. In that moment, the final, horrifying truth crashed down on David Keane. This was not a chance encounter. This was not a failed operation. This was a personal invitation. Someone had given them his name. Someone had given them the exact time, the exact location, and the exact number of men someone had sold them. The man in London, his lifeline, his commander. The trap was not German, it was American. The journey from the blood-soaked field to the gates of hell took 12 hours in the back of a canvas-topped truck. David Keane was chained, his wounded shoulder a throbbing universe of pain. He was no longer an officer. He was cargo, a piece of intelligence wrapped in flesh to be delivered to the specialists. His destination was a place whispered in fear among the resistance, Fresnes prison, just south of Paris. From the outside, it was an imposing brick fortress, but its true function was not containment. It was deconstruction. Fresnes was a factory, and its product was broken men. Here, the Gestapo practiced the science of interrogation, a methodical, patient, and utterly ruthless dismantling of a human being, layer by layer until only the secrets remained. The file contains a detailed schematic of the interrogation wing. It was a place without time. The windows were bricked over. The only light was a single bare bulb that was never turned off. The only sound was the distant, muffled scream of another prisoner, a constant reminder of the process. Keane was assigned an interrogator, SS Hauptsturmführer Brandt. His name appears repeatedly in post-war war crimes testimony. Brandt was not a thug. He was a philosopher of pain, a man who believed that every human had a breaking point, and his job was simply to find it with scientific precision. His methods were not born from rage, but from a cold, detached curiosity. The interrogation of David Keane, designated prisoner number 734, began on July 12th. It would last for 9 months. The transcripts pieced together from Keane's debriefing and captured Gestapo records are a testament to a battle of wills fought in the abyss. Brandt began with civility. He offered cigarettes. He spoke of the futility of resistance. He explained with the calm demeanor of a university professor that he already knew everything, that Keane's commander in London had been cooperative. He laid out the names of the dead from Circuit Voltaire one by one like a dealer laying down a losing hand. It was a psychological attack designed to induce absolute despair, to show Keane that his sacrifice and the sacrifice of his men had been for nothing. When that failed, the physical torture began. It was not random violence. It was a carefully calibrated application of pain, designed to shatter his nerves, destroy his sense of time, and break the connection between his mind and his body. He was subjected to sleep deprivation, starvation, and beatings. Yet through it all, Keane clung to his training. He was a detective. He built a fortress in his mind, a place they could not touch. He compartmentalized the pain. He focused on a single burning image, the face of Captain Frank Miller, smiling from a photograph in his London office. He never gave them anything of value. He confirmed information he knew they already possessed from Miller's betrayal. He gave them the locations of arms caches that had been empty for months. He offered the names of contacts who had long since fled. He fed the beast just enough scraps to survive the day, to endure until the next session. He was buying time, though for what he did not know. The Gestapo, however, had another tool at their disposal, a form of torture more potent than any physical pain. In early August, they brought the other captured survivors of Circuit Voltaire to Fresnes. Brandt forced Keane to watch through a peephole as his men, the French farmers and mechanics he had trained and fought alongside, were interrogated. Then came the final act. In the cold, gray dawn of September 15, 1944, the remaining 7 members of his network were marched into the prison courtyard. Keane was dragged to a window, his face pressed against the glass. He watched as his soldiers were lined up against a brick wall stained with the blood of others. He saw Karen, his face bruised but his posture defiant. He saw the youngest, a boy of 18 who had lied about his age to join. They did not beg, they did not cry. They began to sing La Marseillaise, the French national anthem. Their voices were weak, but they filled the courtyard with a final, desperate act of defiance. The German officer gave a sharp command. The rifles barked, and the voices were silenced. In that moment, something inside David Keane broke. But it was not his will. It was his heart. The pain in his body was meaningless. The scars would fade, but the image of his men singing as they died was burned into his soul forever. He was no longer Lieutenant Keane, OSS operative. He was a witness, a keeper of a debt that could only be paid in blood. He now had a reason to survive. He would endure the unendurable. He would outlast the pain. He would get out of this prison, and he would find the man who had sent his soldiers to that wall. He would find Captain Frank Miller. The months that followed the execution were a descent into a gray, timeless abyss. The records of Fresnes prison during this period are a testament to bureaucratic sadism. For David Keane, survival became a form of rebellion. Each breath he took was an act of defiance. His body was a cage of pain, but his mind had been forged into a weapon. He existed on a diet of watery soup and scraps of bread, his weight dropping to a skeletal level. The interrogations with SS Hauptsturmführer Brandt continued, but they had changed. They were no longer about extracting information. They were a slow, methodical exercise in psychological erosion. But Brandt had miscalculated. He believed he was breaking a spy. He did not realize he was forging an avenger. The image of his men singing in the face of death became Keane's sacrament. The face of Captain Frank Miller became his focus. He survived the beatings. He endured the cold. He clung to the single burning conviction that he would one day stand in a room with the man who had sold him, and justice would be done. As the Allied armies tore across France and crashed against the borders of Germany, the Reich began to crumble from within. The prison system, once a model of ruthless efficiency, devolved into chaos. In the final desperate months of the war, prisoners were moved like cattle. In April of 1945, Keane, along with hundreds of other political prisoners, was packed into a train car and shipped east. His destination, Dachau. He was no longer a high-value intelligence asset. He was just another piece of human refuse to be disposed of. He was liberated on April 29, 1945, by American soldiers. The official report describes the scene. The liberators found heaps of bodies and walking skeletons who looked at them with vacant eyes. Keane was among them. A man who weighed less than 100 pounds, his body a canvas of scars and malnutrition. He was alive, but only just. He was a ghost who had walked out of his own tomb. Weeks of medical care followed. He was slowly nursed back to a shadow of his former self. His body began to heal, but his mind remained in the interrogation cell, in the courtyard at Fresnes. Once he was strong enough to speak, the debriefings began. He sat across from a young, clean-shaven OSS officer in a fresh uniform, and he told his story. He spoke of Circuit Voltaire, of the ambush, of the torture. He spoke of the executions. And then, in a voice scraped raw with memory, he named his betrayer. He named Captain Frank Miller. The young officer listened patiently. He took notes. He nodded sympathetically. And then he delivered the final, most devastating blow of David Keane's war. He was told his story was incredible, that his ordeal must have been disorienting. He was informed that the loss of Circuit Voltaire was a known, tragic event, a German counterintelligence coup. It was a textbook case of a network being rolled up by a highly effective enemy. And Captain Frank Miller? Captain Miller was a hero. His file was exemplary. He had been awarded a medal for his service, for the courage he displayed in managing his networks under extreme pressure. He had written a moving report mourning the loss of his brave agent, Vagabond, and the heroic French patriots who had fallen with him. The official story was written. The file was closed. The system had already rendered its verdict. In that quiet, sterile room, David Keane understood. The betrayal was not the act of one greedy man, it was now systemic. Miller had wrapped himself in the flag, he had built a fortress of lies, and the bureaucracy of the army itself was the wall. Keane's official war was over. He had been liberated. But his real war, his private, personal war, had just begun. The man he had to hunt was not an enemy of the state. He was a decorated American officer. And Keane, the ghost from Fresnes, was the only one who knew the truth. For most soldiers, the end of the war meant returning home. For David Keane, it meant becoming a hunter in the ruins. He was officially a convalescent, a hero recovering from his ordeal. But unofficially, he was a man obsessed. He did not want a parade. He wanted a reckoning. He refused a medical discharge. Instead, he requested a transfer to the one corner of the OSS that was not celebrating victory, but was sifting through the ashes, the X2 counterintelligence branch. His request was granted more out of pity than anything else. He was a broken man, and they gave him a desk job hoping he would fade into the bureaucracy. They underestimated him. They did not understand that a detective, a true detective, is not defined by his badge, but by his refusal to let a case go cold. Keane's case was Captain Frank Miller. From his desk in post-war Germany, he began his own unsanctioned investigation. He worked in the evenings after his official duties were done. He became a creature of the archives, spending hundreds of hours poring over captured German documents. He was looking for a ghost, a single thread in a mountain of paperwork that would connect a decorated American captain to a Gestapo payroll. He found nothing. For months, he hit one dead end after another. Miller's operational records were perfect. His reports were flawless. The official narrative was an iron wall. Keane was a man shouting in a soundproof room. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A team of Army forensic accountants was conducting a massive review of financial records seized from a bank in Lisbon. They were tracking Nazi gold, not hunting American traitors. But in their meticulous work, a junior analyst flagged an anomaly. A payment of 50,000 Reichsmarks made in early July 1944 from an account known to be a front for German intelligence. The recipient account was in a Swiss bank opened under a false name. But the analyst, through painstaking work, had traced the account's true beneficiary. The name on his report was Captain Frank Miller. That single piece of paper was the weapon David Keane had been searching for. It was the crack in the fortress wall. He took the report directly to the head of X2. This time they listened. The financial evidence was irrefutable. The hero's story began to unravel. The arrest was carried out on March 1, 1946. Captain Frank Miller was serving in a comfortable administrative role in Berlin. He was, by all accounts, a model officer, helping to rebuild the very country he had secretly aided. When the military police entered his office, he showed no emotion. The mask of the indignant hero was still firmly in place, but the game was over. The tribunal was convened in secret. The army was not interested in a public scandal. This was a family matter, a stain to be removed quietly. The courtroom was a converted conference room. No press, no audience, just the judges, the lawyers, and the two men whose lives had been intertwined by an act of profound betrayal. When David Keane walked into that room, it was the first time he had seen Frank Miller in person since before his mission began. Keane was gaunt, his face a testament to his 9 months in Fresnes. Miller was healthy, confident, his uniform perfectly pressed. He looked at Keane not with guilt, but with a flicker of annoyance, as if Keane were a ghost who had inconveniently returned from the grave. Keane's testimony was the centerpiece of the trial. He did not speak with passion or with rage. He spoke with the cold, precise clarity of a detective presenting his final report. He recounted the mission, the ambush, the final coded message from Miller that had sent them into the trap. He described the torture. He described the courtyard at Friends. He described the sound of his men singing as the rifles were raised. He did not look at the judges. He looked directly at Captain Frank Miller. He was closing his case. The financial records sealed the verdict. On April 22, 1946, Captain Frank Miller was found guilty of high treason and the murder of 23 French allies. He was sentenced to death by firing squad. The file ends with a simple, stark entry. The sentence was carried out at dawn. There is no mention of where David Keane was that morning, but one can imagine him standing alone, watching the sun rise. His war was finally over. The debt had been paid. The ghosts of Circuit Voltaire could finally rest.